Welcome back to SixSq Classroom. This is lesson number 5 from season 1. And in this video, we are going to learn how to create apps in Nuvla.io. If you remember, Nuvla manages apps that have been built for containers. This means that Nuvla is able to support the more popular and more mainstream container tools out there, which are Docker and Kubernetes. So all you need to know is their native language. So if you know Docker and if you know Kubernetes, you should be good to go in Nuvla.io. If you don't, please go to the official documentation for Docker and Kubernetes, whatever one you prefer. For Docker specifically, try to have a look at the compose file reference because that's the syntax that we use to create Docker applications in Nuvla. So have a look there, understand the syntax and how to create compose files. And for Kubernetes, the same thing. Have a look at manifests and how to create them, how to manage Kubernetes objects through manifests, and those are the configuration files that we use in Nuvla to create the Kubernetes apps. So back to Nuvla, if we go back to the AppStore, as we have done in the past, you will see all the apps that are there. If we want to create one for ourselves, we do need to have our own project, our workspace. So if we scroll down, you will see that there are 2 default projects there. Let's create one for ourselves, okay? Let's create one for our own use that only we can see. If you click on Add, you will see that the options for component and application are grayed out. They are disabled. That's because we always need to be within a project to create those apps. So let's go with the project. Let's name it. We do need to give it a name and also a description. We could also pass a logo image for our project. You can do that. All you need is a URL for the image, but for now, let's just skip that and just save this project. So now we have it there, and you will see there's a new button there called Add. Let's click on it. It's the same as before, but now we have the 2 other options, component and application, enabled. So starting with a component first, let's understand what this is. A component is also an application in Nuvla, but is a single service component. A component maps to a container, one-to-one relationship. It is a high availability container though, because it runs as a service, which means if a node in your infrastructure goes down, this container will be reprovisioned someplace else automatically. But in practice, is a one-to-one mapping, okay? So these are the simplest type of, let's call it application component that you have in Nuvla. So let's go on with it. The first thing that you need to do is to create a name for it, of course. And for this specific lesson, we are going to use something very basic and easy to set up. Let's use Nginx, which is this load balancing and web server application that we can just use from upstream. They have a quite an easy way to set up their software. So let's just use Nginx components. Let's copy their logo just for fun so that we can see our apps in the App Store with a sort of graphical feedback. So let's copy paste this, put it there. Let's set a description for our new component. We do need to provide this as well. And after that, you see here, there's a one-to-one mapping with a Docker image. So for Nginx, there's a public Docker image already called Nginx. We have to provide the Docker registry, the image name, and the tag. Okay, so here the default is Docker Hub, so just leave it as it is. The image repository is Nginx, so that's the one that we want to use. And the tag by default is latest, that's the one that we want to use, so just leave it there. Then we have architectures. We could set up architectures. This is an information or a metadata field. For now, just leave it like that. And if we had a private registry instead of Docker Hub, this is where we would select it, okay? For now, it's quite simple. We are using Docker Hub. Let's move on. Do we have port mappings? Well, yes. So Nginx provides a web server. There's a web page that we can access after deploying it. So we do want to map a port from the container to the host where we will be deploying this application, okay, this component. So the destination port, let's just fix it for now. Let's say 8080, and the internal port is 80. So that's you'll find that in the documentation for Nginx that it runs by default on port 80. Okay, the protocol is TCP, so let's just leave it like that. Let's scroll down. Environment variables, we could set some of those. For now, let's just leave it empty. Volumes as well. We will use all of those later for other applications. And we have URLs. This is an important one because it's a place where you can define dynamic URLs that you can access after your component or application are deployed. So you just give it a name. For our case, it's a web endpoint. And then the URL, it's something that you can define dynamically so that Nuvla can resolve once the component or application is deployed. So in our use case, for example, we don't know which port to access Nginx after it has been deployed. But let's say we don't know the host name, we don't know the infrastructure, the IP of the node where this will be running once we deploy it. So we can just write down here HTTP and just put the $host name, and then let's put the port, and because it's a fixed port, we just write down 8080, and that's it. Once we deploy this thing, the $host name will be replaced automatically, and we get the web endpoint. Output parameters, something that you can define as well, custom parameters for your application to use, but in this case, let's just skip it, data bindings, skip it, and save. Every time you save, very much like Git, you should provide a commit that's used to keep track of versions. So we do that, and now we have a component. Okay, this is your very, very basic application component, and we have done this. And if you go back to the AppStore, there it is. You can find it, a new entry in the AppStore. That's your application. Only you can see it for now because we haven't shared it with the public, but it appears in your App Store. Okay, so you can see both your applications and public ones. So let's go back to our project, and now let's do the same thing, but for a Kubernetes application. Now we have something a bit more complex, so we want to start an application that can be composed of one or more objects. Okay, so let's click on application. And again, let's use Nginx because we want to keep this consistent and while keeping it simple as well. Give a name to this application, Nginx, and the description as well. There we go. Let's also, let's just find a different image just to distinguish them once we have built them in the App Store. Let's copy the URL, paste it there. And very important, in sub-projects, you want to change this to Kubernetes. Okay, let's go down. Environment variables, not for now, we'll do it the next time. Files, nothing for now as well. And our manifest. Okay, so this is the place where we are going to write down our manifest file, the YAML file that is used by Kubernetes to deploy and to manage Kubernetes objects. Okay, so as I said before, the syntax doesn't change. We comply with a native language that is supported by Kubernetes. We can just type the raw YAML file in this text area. Okay, so let's start. First, we need to define a service because we want to expose this Nginx container outside the host so that we can access it afterwards. Let's name our service and define the spec for it. And the port that we want to publish this service onto is from port 80 inside the container. And we'll just let Kubernetes decide which port to use. So if you do just that, Kubernetes will assign a random port from a specific range in your host, and we can get access to that port later on from Nuvla dynamically using the URL. You will see how in a few seconds. Then we create another object inside the same manifest, and this time we are going to create a deployment, which is for our Nginx container. So here we are labeling this deployment with the Nginx app label, and you see that's the same app used for the selector on top for the service. Let's say we want 3 replicas of this deployment. So here again, labels app Nginx. Let's be consistent with the naming here. And then finally the spec, we are going to name the container as Nginx and set the image as being the Nginx Docker image. And the container port that we are going to expose is port 80. And that's pretty much it. Now we have the service up there that is doing a bind to the application called Nginx, which is set down there. Okay, so that's how the service will find the deployment containers and fetch the port to be exposed outside the host. So now using this information, we can again create the URL that we have done before for the component. Let's again specify the host name here. But now, because the port is random, so remember that we have assigned port 80 as the one to be exposed, but we haven't defined what is the target and node ports to be used by the service. So we are letting Kubernetes decide by itself. This means that we can use yet another keyword here to let Nuvla do the work for us, which is the type of object dot name of that object dot protocol dot the internal port. And once we do that, Nuvla will know that you are searching for that specific mapping, and it will give you back later on as part of the URL what is the port that has been created by Kubernetes. So let's save this. Again, we have to write down the commit to keep track of the versions. Okay. And if we go back here, now we have 2 applications, and you can see that in the App Store. Well, one is a component, the other one is a Kubernetes app. So finally, what we want to do now is do the same thing, but with Docker. So let's go back to our project. And let's create a new application. This time we are creating a Docker application, so you can see that there is a Docker Compose text area down there. As usual, let's name it. And we are reusing the same Nginx approach as before. Description, same thing. Keep Docker as a subtype. And let's fetch, yet again, a different image. Copy the URL. And put it there. Paste. Okay. This time we will set up an environment variable, but let's go back to it once we need it. And as we have done for manifest, here as well, let's paste our raw or write down our raw compose file. So this might be a bit simpler, so let's just start with the compose file here, version number 3. We are going to set a Docker volume. You'll see why later, because we'll do something a bit fancier in this example here. So let's set up a volume called classroom frontend. It's a local driver, which is important. And then let's define our services. First, we start with the usual one, the web, which is the Nginx application from the Nginx Docker image in Docker Hub. We want to publish port 80. And here again, because we are just saying port 80, we are telling Docker to also randomize port in the host. And here we are going to use the Docker volume, a data volume, to map our HTML files from inside Nginx to the local volume managed by Docker. Okay, so that's pretty much the same thing that we have done for the component and the Kubernetes app. Now let's just again create the URL for our deployments later on. Again, host name, and for compose, the same sort of concept as for Kubernetes. Here, just put the name of the service, the protocol, and the port that you want to get mapped. And Nuvla will dynamically resolve this after deployment. So that's pretty much it. Let's save it. Let's commit. Write some message here. and save. So now we have pretty much the same thing as before. You can see here that Nuvla will validate the compose file for you, and will also tell you whether your application is compatible with Docker Swarm or Docker Compose. Okay? By default, it always falls back into Swarm because we prefer using the container orchestration engine. But if, for example, you put an option here in your Compose file, which is Docker Compose specific, like container name, which only works for Docker Compose, and then you save, you will see the compatibility mode will change. And from now on, your application, it's still Docker, but it will be deployed as a Docker Compose software stack. So it will not be distributed. There will not be multiple nodes involved in this deployment. Okay, that's an option that you can explore while using Nuvla. For now, let's keep Docker Compose because we are going to add a new service just for fun, which let's assume is a backend container that is feeding our front end. Okay, so it's a Alpine container which we will use to write data as HTML into the Nginx container so that we can see that later on in the web page. So here, for the first time, let's create an environment variable called myMood, and you will see that we assign that to mood, and we can define that as an environment variable through Nuvla. Okay, this is very useful because at deployment time, you can change this environment variable. And for every deployment, you can change, they can be different. You can assign it as being required or not. And Nuvla will pick it up and replace it in your compose file at deployment time. You can also make use of static environment variables, it's up to you, or even use the service templates offered by Docker Swarm. But since we are deploying in Docker Compose, let's just remove this environment variable from here. Just as a note, if you would put something which is Docker Compose specific and something which is Swarm specific in the same compose file, Nuvla will tell you that there is a conflict, but it will fall back, it will have as a default Swarm, okay? So if you have both options, Nuvla will ignore the ones that are meant for compose and deploy with Swarm. So that's why we got rid of that service template environment variable. And for now, let's just stick with Docker Compose because we want these two components, these two containers to run on the same host. So that's why we use Docker Compose here in this example. So volumes, we are using the same volume as before. And you can see that for this Alpine container, we are going to bind that volume to /tmp inside the Alpine container. And let's assign a command. A command is very simple. It's just a while loop, which is doing an echo using the environment variables to a HTML file, which is in the data volume that we have defined above. Now, what this means is that because the Alpine container can write into that volume while the web one is only read-only, you can see that with the RO flag at the end of the volume option up there. Here, we are using the same container, which is mapping to the Nginx HTML directory. And we are writing into that directory. We are writing these environment variables plus some other data continuously in a loop. And what this will allow us to do is to refresh the web page through this data volume. So let's just save this, new commit there. And you can see the versions there. Now we have multiple versions because we have saved these more than once. And some details as well, just some extra details, not really important here, but you can see who is the owner and that this is actually an application. And that's pretty much it. If we go back to the App Store, you will see the 3 apps that we have created. On the top right corner for this specific app, you can see the compatibility mode. In this case, it's Docker Compose. Otherwise, it would have been Swarm. And on the right side, there's the Kubernetes application and then the component. So that's pretty much it. We have just created a component in Nuvla, which is a one-to-one mapping with a container, a Kubernetes application, and a Docker application in the form of Docker Compose. If you would like to explore a bit more the App Store, you can click on different applications, see what they are made of. You can click to see their definition. You can also search in the App Store for specific applications, click and see how they have been built. Most of them, obviously, you will not be able to edit because they are not your own. You do not own them, but you can see them. And you can also explore the projects there, which have been made public. Search for different apps and components. Again, click on them and see how they have been built. So you can learn a bit more on how to build applications in Nuvla if you are exploring applications from other users and from SixSq. So I hope you have enjoyed this. Good luck creating your new applications. Try to follow this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers!